It's now my pleasure to introduce the person who will introduce our speaker tonight, Brian Gibbons, who's a professor of history here at Seaver College. And so, Brian, if you come and introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Let's see if I can just get my notes out of here, just so I don't lose my place. Well, when Dean Mars asked if I would do the introduction this evening, I, of course, said yes. But I wasn't real clear exactly what was expected. What should I do? And so he gave me an answer. Take 2 or 3 minutes and, review Dr. Larson's academic achievements. And I thought, sure, no problem. But then I began to look. I began to look into what that involved, and I quickly realized it was,
sorry about that.
Oh, sorry. That this was an impossible task. Still no? We'll go for this one. This was an impossible task to do in 2 to 3 minutes, so I decided not to do it. After all, 10 books, over 100 articles, a JD, a PhD, a Pulitzer, numerous really incalculable appointments, accolades, honors. Impossible. So I decided not to do that and instead introduce Ed tonight with an anecdote. And it's an anecdote about the first time that I met him, even though he wasn't in the same room as I was. This was the summer of 1998. And while on break from grad school at UCLA, I was doing jury duty. And these were the bad old days in LA when you had to do 10 days or a completed trial. So since I suspected that I would have plenty of time on my hands, I got a new arrival from the History Book Club. It had just come out, Summer for the Gods. And this book interested me particularly because, well, I've always kind of been a history wonk. And as an undergrad, I'd actually read the entire Scopes transcript, not for an assignment. That shows you I have a real problem. But I was very pleased that I read the book. And upon reading it, I was one of the first impressions was just the breadth of evidence that I saw. And not just the trial, which I was familiar with, but just lots of contemporary documents. But it wasn't just the evidence. It was the fact that this evidence was pulled together and is placed into a broader context that made that evidence comprehensible and a very good read. But it wasn't just that struck me. And of course, this is a time when I only knew Ed Larson as a name at the front of the book. It was that I thought for such a contentious issue, an issue that can still stir passions to this day, I was immediately impressed by how balanced and fair. I could tell that he wanted to be fair to these participants and to this event. And then finally, really capping all these other virtues, I was favorably impressed by just a really robust and intelligent assessment of the significance, kind of the key significance of this trial, not only in the 1920s, but even to our own day. So, evidence, context, balance, significance. And I think those are words that have really characterized all of Ed's scholarly work. And so, now that I know Ed is more than a name, it's my honor tonight to introduce him, my esteemed colleague and my friend, Ed Larson.
Well, I thank you for those wonderfully kind words. I should just sit down now because everything that goes from here will just be downhill and will reduce the people's view of me. So thank you very much for that. It's a tremendous honor. It's great to have you introduce me. Brian is truly a friend. He's a great teacher. He's a great friend. He's a great colleague. Also, it's a great honor to have my introducer be introduced by Rick Mars, who's been a fabulous dean. Mary Mullins in the front row, who's been the chair of our division, does a remarkable job. But most of all, to be able to speak in this lecture series, David Baird. David Baird's a neighbor. David Baird is a great historian, one of the great historians of the American West. He's been a legend here. He was a shaping dean of Seaver College, and so it's just an honor to be be speaking in his lecture series. I hope I don't embarrass you, David. Now, this is what it looks like at the South Pole now. If you went down, it'd still be light, yep, and just barely, let's see. Yeah, just still barely be a little light. It would look like this, and you can see the two, I don't know if you can read them, but you can see the two dates. They have the two dates of the two first people who made it to the South Pole, and a quote by each of them there at the pole. And as you could read from looking at those dates, that it was 100 years ago last December that a 5-man Norwegian team led by Roald Amundsen, that's the quote on this side, and there he is, became the first team to reach the South Pole. I sort of like to use this picture because this is how Amundsen either pictured himself or liked others to picture him, because this is the picture in the frontispiece of his book, The South Pole, his own book about going there. Those furs, those Inuit furs that he's wearing are obviously not from the South Pole because there are no polar bears in the South Pole. They're in the North Pole. If there were any polar bears in the South Pole, there wouldn't be any penguins. But he had, before going to the South Pole, he had led the first expedition through the first ship to make it through the Northwest Passage. And that took 3 years because it was frozen in place twice as he was making it through. And so it gave him plenty of time to learn skiing. He was already a good skier from Norway. To learn dog sledding, how to be a dog sledding, and of course to learn the clothing you'd wear on a trip that made him ideally suited, and that was the Inuit furs that you see him. 100 years ago this year, in January of 1911, a similarly sized British band under the command of Robert Falcon Scott reached the same place, only to find that the Norwegians had gotten there first by five weeks. Now this is Scott's picture from the frontispiece of his book. This is how he presented himself, and I suppose if you just look at the clothes, you realize why he didn't get there first. It's not what you probably should be wearing if you wanted to make it to the pole right. He didn't actually wear clothes like these, but they were almost as ill-suited. And this week, I guess on Thursday, marks the 100th anniversary of the death of Scott and the remaining members of his party on their long, cold march back from the South Pole. When word of their deaths reached the waiting world a year later, there were no radios back then. They had to go, the search party had to find him after the winter was over the next spring. Scott became a hero of the empire and a global celebrity, even though he'd gotten to the pole second. Over time and countless retellings, their story became an epic tale of adventure, competition, triumph, and tragedy in the frozen land. Well, given the drama of the British Death March, the remarkable efficiency of the Norwegian effort, and the worldwide attention focused on the supposed race between the two parties, I'm not surprised that historians and popularizers alike have focused the narrative of all these expeditions on this so-called race to the pole, the quest for the pole. But as a historian of science, I'm not drawn to that story. I'm drawn to the science of these expeditions. Researchers on Scott's 2 Antarctic expeditions, and there were 2, not 1, he just died on the second one, and an intervening one led by Ernst Shackleton, plus other expeditions, a half dozen other expeditions from other countries like Germany and Sweden, opened an unknown continent to science and enriched our understanding of global meteorological, biological, and oceanographical systems. Together, the 3 British expeditions, each of which wintered with over 30 men on Antarctica's Ross Island, proved that the southern continents were once linked together, all the southern continents, and returned with clear evidence of global climate change. To me, not only are the stories of doing science in extreme conditions at least as gripping as those about getting to the pole, they are part of a more significant narrative that continues today in the vast amount of research still conducted in the Antarctic. Further, they help to explain why Scott trailed far behind Amundsen in getting to the pole, despite having many more men and much greater resources. Now, let me just say at the outset, giving credit, because I'm going to focus on a little bit on the pole tonight, given the anniversary time that we're at. But giving credit to the science of Scott's expedition takes nothing at all away from Amundsen's achievements. Only the Norwegians reached the pole and returned safely, and they did so over an unknown route with food to spare. Further, the pursuit of science does not excuse Scott for poor choices that, combined with forgivable misfortune, contributed to suffering and death on his polar journey. But it does provide perspective. That's what I'm doing tonight. Provide some perspective and give meaning for the British endeavor. And so what I thought I'd do, it's not like my book does it at all, but what I thought I'd do tonight in this period when we're just around the 100th anniversary of Scott's death, what I thought I'd do is go back a half year before Amundsen arrived at the pole and try to compare the two narratives. Again, my book doesn't do it this way. It doesn't focus on this, but retell the story just by looking at, and you'll see how different these two expeditions are just by looking at the last 6 months, and that's about all I can fit into the time we have now. So let me try to do that. So that means we start our story in June of 1911. Now at that time, and I don't know if you can all see this, I don't know if I have a pointer or not on this, it doesn't look like it. You go back to June of 1911, Scott and Amundsen were at their respective winter quarters. What you did, which were about 600 miles apart on opposite ends of Ross Ice Shelf sea edge. Now what you used to do back then, you had no radio once you went into the Antarctic. Once you left the last port, be it Hobart or Christchurch or wherever you left from, you would have no more contact with the outside world. You'd go down in a previous summer, because you can only get through the ice pack. This sea ice, now remember we're talking about the South Pole, so you've got to turn the world upside down. The South Pole is right at the top of your map. Everything's turned upside down. Antarctic is here. These are down toward New Zealand, and Australia are down here. This is all frozen over in the winter, in their winter. They would go down in the summer. You would camp for the winter. And then in spring, you were free to go out and do your scientific research, or in the case of the captains who were not needed for scientific research, you'd be free to go to the pole or try whatever adventure you wanted to. So Scott's over here on Ross Island, which is an island that sticks out of what's listed there as the barrier. The land is what's sort of dark on the edge. That's the Antarctica continent. The barrier is now called the Ross Ice Shelf, and it's literally a shelf of freshwater glacier that comes down from the glaciers off the Antarctic plateau and then forms, and icebergs break off the edge of it, but that's just year-round ice. If you go up to the edge of it, the reason why it's called a barrier, if you go up to the edge of it and shift, it's about 200 feet high, just a wall of ice. And the only other place, you can't really disembark anywhere else except called the Bay of Whales, which is a break in the barrier that had been found 10 years before by Scott on his first expedition. And there's sort of an opening where you can sort of sail in and get up on top and camp on this temporary floating, because this ice barrier is floating on the water. It's a glacial tongue, actually, a huge one. So Amundsen's over there. That's about 400 miles apart on two different ends of the polar plateau. So they're wintering over there. The sun had set on both camps in late April. Remember, the sun never rises. Half the year it's dark and half the year it's light. So they were in midwinter darkness until September. So they had the whole winter where they could be preparing for the trip, which is what Amundsen was doing, the trip that was going to start the following spring, which would be September, October. Now, Amundsen and his men remained in camp during this period, devoting their time solely to preparing themselves and their equipment for the polar trip ahead. They set off first for the pole on October 19. From that point on, with 4 sledges and beginning with 52 dogs, it was a dash across the Ross Ice Shelf, what's called the barrier. You can see his route, Amundsen. Route there, up the Axel Halberg Glacier, which runs up through the mountains And then you get up on the polar plateau, which is about 9,000 feet high, and across the polar plateau to the pole itself, which is right off the top of your map there. And they arrived on December 14. The Norwegians, when they got there, saw no sign of Scott. They camped for 4 days, and here they are. Using every available means they had to confirm their position. They didn't have any geocentric, they didn't have any satellites to tell them where they were. They had to take readings from the sun to determine if they truly were at the pole. And they left 4 days later on December 17th. They left behind a small tent with the Norwegian flag right at the pole. Here are 4 of the Norwegians. Amundsen is in the back. Of course, somebody has to take the picture, so one's out of the picture. They left some excess provisions in the tent and a note for Scott, who they assumed would arrive shortly. The first sentence of Amundsen's chapter on his return trip, his journal, reads, "The going was splendid and all were in good spirits, so we went along at a great pace. The weather remained fair most of the way. Much of the route, of course, you're going back down the glacier, so it's downhill. And the wind is blowing out because of the temperature climates. Your wind is always blowing out from the pole. Improvised sails were hoisted on the sleds. Those sleds went so fast at times that the skiers struggled to keep up. Rations steadily increased for men and dogs as they passed their evenly spaced supply depots. Some of the food was left behind. The polar party reached its ship back at the Bay of Whales in good health and high spirits on the 25th of January, 1912, after 99 days out and back. Amundsen had gained weight. Now, the story is quite different, of course, for Scott and his men. And it's a lot more complicated. Because Amundsen, they're just focused on the pole, and they're all going there. Scott has 4 times as many men. And if we go back 6 months before, which is what I said I'd do, not all of these men were even wintering at the same place. Scott had remote bases for scientific research. And I'll just tell a couple of the stories of what was happening during these 6 months. 6 of the men, including the expedition's 3rd officer, really a remarkable Antarctic explorer named Victor Campbell, and geologist Raymond Priestley, who was a veteran of Shackleton's previous Nimrod expedition, had been dispatched, and here they are at their base, over to the Antarctic mainland to conduct scientific research at Cape Adair. And they wintered there in this hut the year before Scott left. So in June of 1911, they were there. Just to give an idea where they were, I'll just go back to this slide. They're actually down here. Scott's way up there. This party, and they're really, they would be men who would have been tremendously helpful in getting Scott to the pole. They're wintering down here. During that first winter, making scientific studies, taking meteorological readings, doing a variety of scientific activity and geological research while they're there. Now, when the winter ended, rather than immediately, the ship went over to pick them up, but rather than take them back to the main base, which is up there on Ross Island, where they could help Scott get to the pole. The pole was incidental for the British. They were taken up here to Terra Nova Bay, which is on the mainland here, which is a very, very geologically interesting place and glaciologically interesting place. It still is. The Italians have their permanent base there now. It's where 3 great glaciers come down through the Victoria Land Mountains from the polar plateau and come together and meet at the coast. There's lots of interesting moraines. There's important glaciers there. And they were put there for what was supposed to be a month of geological research and glaciological research. Before the ship was supposed to come back and pick them up and take them back to the main base, where once reunited, they would go back to Britain. Well, that was the plan. Things don't always work about the plan. Terra Nova Bay is truly a fine place. I've been there, a fine place for a month of geological research in the summer. But in winter, after that ship that was supposed to pick them up at the end of the summer was blocked by the encroaching sea ice from picking them up, from getting to land. And yet the sea ice was so unstable that they couldn't get out to the ship. In short, after they were left there at Terra Nova Bay for a second winter, without that cabin that they had at Cape Evans or that the main base had, and the temperatures plunged far below zero, it became an awful place to live. But the season was too late for them to come back. The only other way to come back would be to go around on land, but that's not really land, it's really cliffs. Go around the edge and come back. It's too late, it was getting dark, there was no way. They were going to have to stay at Terra Nova Bay. Well, during virtually the entire winter, and a little bit of their story tells you how much of the tremendous, precious resources and best men of Scott's expedition were devoted to activities utterly unrelated to reaching the pole. Now, during the winter, fierce winds blow in off the polar plateau, down those three glaciers, and then coming from three directions, mix right where they're camped. There's no way these people are going to be able to survive in their summer tents. The tents would be blown to pieces. And they had only brought enough food and fuel along for their planned short 1-month summer stay. As Priestley wrote in his diary at the time, it is evident that three things were absolutely necessary. We must have light. Remember, there's no sun in the middle of winter. It's dark 24 hours a day. We must have light, shelter, and hot food. Well, looking first for shelter, Campbell and Priestley found a large drift of packed snow on a boulder-strewn coastal ridge that they affectionately named Inexpressible Island. Priestley wrote, "We first sank a trench 3 feet by 4 feet in depth to a depth of 6 feet. Then from the side of it, we picked out a large cave toward the thickest part of the drift. When finished, this cave," and here you see a picture of it, taken the next year, this cave, which was 12 feet wide and 9 feet long and not quite tall enough, not quite high enough for a man to stand, became the party's winter quarters, where they spent the entire winter. As Campbell noted, "Our roof is hard snow, about 3 feet thick, while the walls and floors are ice." The men they didn't have any, they had brought in a stove along, but they ran out of fuel. They didn't have any of the fuel oil because they used it all up in their summer. So what they did is they heated and cooked with a jerry-rigged tin stove. They took the fuel can and cut off the top and made it into a tin stove where they would burn seal blubber. And this burning seal blubber that they heated and cooked with caked everything inside the cave, including the men, with greasy black soot. Light came from burning their shoestrings in blubber lamps. To prevent the ceiling from melting, they kept the inside temperature below freezing, and when not doing their chores, spent day and night in their threadbare sleeping bags. Well, with shelter and light found, such as it was, food became their preoccupation. Campbell tapped Priestley to ration the stores, and there he is down in his hole. From the scant remaining supplies, he set aside the barest minimums for the anticipated spring sledge trip back. They knew they were going to have to walk back. So they set aside what they'd need to walk back, because the ship wouldn't even know they'd survived. And they divided all the remaining food in the months ahead. Well, this allocation left each person with only a biscuit and a mug of weak cocoa or tea per day, 12 lumps of sugar and 2 ounces of chocolate every week, and 25 raisins each month. Beyond these rations, the parties lived on what they killed, which meant every seal and penguin that wandered their way that winter. There were never enough. Seal became the staple, with the meat and organs cooked into a stew and the blubber fried, eaten raw, or used for fuel. Everyone found seal meat so insipidly bland that the cooks made the stew with seawater for added salt and raided the medicine kit for flavoring, with mixed results. Now, one tip for those of you who are cooks. To the general dismay, seal cooked with a mustard plaster, back then they'd have mustard plaster for bruises, doesn't taste like mustard like they hoped. It tastes more like linseed oil. But as Priestley noted, stew made with the mustard plaster, as bad as it was, quote, even this was a welcome change from undiluted seal. Biscuits ran out in August, chocolate and sugar ran out in September, but seal stew continued day after day after day, even after a tainted batch caused food poisoning. Dysentery became endemic, and as the captain noted, this is most inconvenient in this weather when to be out in the wind for a few seconds means frostbite. And you can guess, since we're talking about dysentery, where that frostbite was. The meat-only diet also caused a lack of bladder control. Some of us, Campbell wrote, have been wetting our clothes in our sleep. One of us even while he was awake before he could get out the door. And these are the clothes we have to live in for 18 months. They had no change of clothes. This is how they would just, and there was no place to wash because there wasn't any water to wash with. They would scrape out their clothes. This is how they looked after their winter. Somehow the party survived the winter, and in spring, man-hauled, they had no dogs to help them, man-hauled 2 sledges over 2 deeply crevassed ice tongues and 200 miles of often disturbed sea ice to the expedition's main base. The trip took 38 days. They frequently floundered up to their sockets of their thighs in snow, and the sledges regularly capsized on the slopes. Nevertheless, during the entire way back, Priestley gathered rock specimens and carried them back. He was a geologist. This was a geological field trip. These specimens included plant fossils that offered important evidence that Antarctica was once warm enough to sustain a rich flora. Field research on Scott's 2 expeditions, as well as Shackleton's intervening one, had been the first to find such evidence of historic climate change in the Antarctic. From their observations of glacial deposits and ice-free valleys, they survived that the Antarctic climate was now warming again, a hypothesis that glacial research by this group of people further confirmed. Its winter ordeal, however, became the party's greatest legacy. It returned with a tale of endurance in ice unsurpassed in the annals of British polar exploration, and none of it was done for the glory of getting to the pole. All of it was done in the name of science. Now here's, after they shaved, this is how they looked after they got back, and this is only one sledge made it the whole way. This is a sledge they had to pull back. Now, these exploits that I just described were not even the most significant diversion of resources from Scott to the pole. Let me tell one other story like this that is even more directly applicable of impacting Scott's effort to reach the pole. 6 months prior to the polar journey, 6 months before Amundsen reached the pole, so 3 months before they actually left for the pole, 2 of the 5 men that would accompany Scott to the pole, this fellow, Edward Wilson, and H.R. Bertie Bowers, who we'll see later, were not even preparing for this journey. Remember, Amundsen at this time, in June of 1911, were focused entirely on getting to the pole, and all their men. But these 2 people, Wilson and Bowers, who we'll see later, who would accompany Scott to the pole, were instead of in the base during the death of winter, total darkness. Instead of being there preparing for the trip, they were on a death-defying midwinter scientific research trip. This effort exemplified the extreme lengths to which Scott's expedition went for science. At the time, British ornithologist P.L. Slater, then probably the greatest ornithologist in the world, maintained that penguins were the oldest surviving type of birds and that emperors were the most ancient species of penguin. On the earlier expedition, on the far end of Ross Island at Cape Crozier, during Scott's earlier expedition, 10 years before, explorers had been the first ever to discover an emperor penguin rookery. No one had ever been found before. Indeed, there had only been a few emperor penguins ever seen before that expedition. But they found a colony to them. And Wilson, who was Slater's man on that expedition as well, and he was there down to study the birds, had determined that these remarkable birds laid and hatched their eggs in midwinter. Now, we all know that today because we watch those cartoons about them, but no one at the time knew any bird did that. So And he had visited this colony in the late fall and early spring and determined that they hatched and raised their young in the middle of winter, when he knew temperatures must drop to these incredible temperatures. So he wanted to go back in the middle of winter to watch this breeding process. In particular, in line with then current evolutionary theory, Wilson wanted to see if the youngest embryos of the supposed oldest avian species displayed vestiges of reptilian teeth. If Wilson could find evidence in penguin embryos, that would be inside, you crack open the eggs and study the embryos, linking these two classes of animals, birds and reptiles, then he would confirm the hypothesis of Slater that birds had descended evolutionarily from reptiles. That's why he wanted to go back. Well, to reach the rookery in midwinter, Wilson, Bowers, and assistant geologist Apsley Cherry Gerard left in the middle of winter, June, for a 70-mile trek to Cape Crozier. Now you can sort of, here they are heading out. Of course, it's pitch black because the sun never comes up in June. It's the middle of winter. And there they are with their sledge, Bowers, Wilson, and Cherry Gerard. With scientific equipment, because they had to take all their equipment to study these embryos and do their research, cold weather gear and supplies loaded on 2 9-foot sledges. You can see one here and another one just starting there. The men would, the 2 sledges were going to be linked end to end, and then to the men in harnesses. The 3 men would haul over 750 pounds. They did not use dogs because there would be nothing, they were planning to do a month of research and there'd be nothing to do with the dogs when they were there. So they were going to pull this sledge themselves for this 70 miles each way. Now, the outward bound journey went about as well as you can expect. And remember, originally, these 3 men were the 3 that were going to accompany Scott to the pole. One of them, well, we'll find out what happens to him. But the idea is they're going to start at their main base, which is on this island. This barrier, the Ross Ice Shelf, pushes against the southern part. And the rest sticks out that in the summer it is open water. In the winter it's frozen over. They're going to go down. They're going to have to go around from where their base is around to Cape Crozier, which is the far edge. The men traveled south from down to Cape Armitage, down to the corner, and then they went up on the Ross Ice Shelf and tried to cross it. Then it got cold. Colder than had ever previously been recorded anywhere in the history by any people. As they traveled along the southern side of Ross Island from Cape Armitage to Cape Crozier on the Ross Ice Shelf, below minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Pitch dark. And when you get snow, when you get it that cold, the snow changes to almost like a sand-like consistency, and which meant that they were pulling this sledge. Sledges are designed on skis, and they're designed to be pulled across snow, normal snow, or ice. But instead it's like sand. So you imagine these sledges loaded with 750 pounds and pulling them on a sandy beach. They would sink into the sand, so you'd be pulling them through the sand. And the snow would be hitting across the front of them, which forced the men to relay their sledges. They would get no slide at all. And so they would have to pull one and then go back and get the other one and pull it, which means, of course, 1 mile gain for 3 miles walked. So they would net about 2 miles per day during this stage of the journey. Finally, on July 15, after 3 weeks of hauling, the men climbed onto a windswept rocky moraine at the far end overlooking Cape Crozier. Somewhere in the sea ice about 4 miles east, shrouded in darkness, lay the rookery. Now, you couldn't take pictures, of course, because it was dark, but Wilson was a bit of an artist, and this is his drawing of the rookery when they found it. Now, before trying to reach the rookery, if it wasn't bad enough, the men built a stone hut on the moraine where they planned to live and work while studying the emperor penguins. Now you wonder, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they just be in a tent? Well, the trouble is they're trying to do this research on these penguin embryos. So they can't let the eggs freeze, because if they freeze, they'll lose all their detail. So they have to go down, get the eggs, the fertilized eggs, keep them warm, get back to a hut they're building, keep the hut above freezing, they have all their lab equipment, and then study these embryos. It took 3 days for them to complete the project. Using a sledge as a ceiling beam, they stretched canvas over the top of 4 rock walls, caulked cracks with snow, and assembled a blubber stove for heat. To protect it from the storm sweeping off the sea ice, they built the hut into the lee side of the moraine, just below the ridge. With the hut up and in need of blubber for fuel, they set out for penguins. Now, making full use of the midday twilight that now dimly illuminated the ice for a couple hours, about 4 hours each day, the men tried twice to reach the rookery. They couldn't maneuver down there in total darkness, because what you have to do is you have to drop off the cliffs, and then you're in this labyrinth of ice. Because what's happening is this great ice barrier is pushing onto the island, and it buckles up into these hummocks of ice that go about 60, 70, 100 feet high. And there are ridges of them, and you go through them like a labyrinth. And you can hear the penguins, but you can't see them. And you've got to work your way through. The first day they never did. They just wandered in the hummock for the whole time. They left a trail, of course, so they could get back, and they went back. The next day they tried again, a little different way, and they managed, after about 3 hours of exploring, to make it to the penguins. So they knew how to get there, but they reached the rookery that second time just before it got dark. And so they faced a dilemma. As Cherry Gerard wrote in his diary, after indescribable effort and hardship, we were witnessing a marvel of the natural world. We had within our grasp material that might prove of the utmost importance to science. We were turning theories into facts with every observation we made, but we only had a few moments to give. They hadn't brought enough supplies to stay out, nor could they get back in the dark. So they quickly skinned 3 penguins for blubber, grabbed 6 eggs, and bolted for the hut with the expectation of returning the next day for serious research. Now, these are the 3 eggs, the only 3 eggs that survived. They're in the British Museum today. Now, unfortunately for them, the weather, after they got back to the hut, deteriorated and threatened to become much worse. By situating the hut just below the ridge, Wilson hoped to protect it from the winds that would come off the island and down toward the Ross ice shelf. But he didn't expect that this particular storm would be coming in off the Ross ice shelf and going up the mountain, which meant he placed his hut right in the track of powerful updrafts. The storm's first strong gust ballooned the canvas roof upward and sucked snow in through every crack. The men piled slabs of ice on the roof during lulls in the storm, but it made little difference. The brunt of the storm hit the following night with hurricane-force winds, causing the hut's roof to rise and fall with growing violence until about noon on the 3rd day, it exploded outward in shreds, leaving the men cowering in their sleeping bags under drifting snow and rubble from the roof and the walls. It was Wilson's 39th birthday. 70 miles from winter quarters, without shelter, Cherry Gerard lost all hope and began thinking about taking morphine from the medicine chest to ease the end. The storm subsided a day later, however, and they headed back to Maine Base. The eggs they had collected had been lost or frozen, rendering them useless for embryo research. Their supplies were broken apart. They couldn't do any further research. Well, the return trip was a living hell. The exhausted parties first had to recross the pressure ridges and crevassed land iced around Cape Crozier. Then pass over the frigid ice shelf to Cape Armitage before turning north on the sea ice to winter quarters. With only about 4 hours of dim twilight, the sun never came up, but it was a dim twilight for 4 hours, but at least 16 hours of man-hauling these sledges each day, darkness remained a severe handicap. Wilson wrote, "We traveled as much by ear and by feel of the snow and ice underfoot as by sight. At one point, Bowers dropped into a deep bottomless crevasse. Remember, they're on a ice shelf that is 1,000 feet thick, and heaven only knows how far down the crevasses go. And Bowers dropped into it and hung by his sledging harness out of sight until he was rescued by a rope. Here is Wilson's picture of it. His drawing of it. Now, you have no idea where that ends. The one advantage of man-hauling your sledges is you're hooked up in these harnesses. So if you do fall through a crevasse, your harness catches you. You don't keep falling down to your certain death. But, of course, you're pulling the sledge after you. So Wilson has to drop down on a rope to try to get him out. Meanwhile, Cherry Garrard is hanging on for dear life at the other end of the sledge, because if the sledge goes down, well, that's the end. Temperatures again plunged toward minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, making their sleeping bags worthless for warmth, so that they could get in them at night. A problem with sleeping bags in that weather is at night you sweat, and the water goes out into the sleeping bag, and as soon as you leave it, it immediately freezes solid, because it's 70 degrees below Fahrenheit. So it immediately is solid. So if you rolled up your sleeping bag at the end of the night, you would never get it unrolled. It would be totally impossible. So what they did at night is they laid their sleeping bags out flat after they got out of them and stuffed them with their clothes. And then they left them, and then they laid them on top of their sledges. And they'd freeze solid, and then when they wanted to get in at night, they'd pull the clothes out and they would slide in the open hole. By the end of the trip, each 17-pound sleeping bag had accumulated up to 27 pounds of ice. Cherry Garrard complained of uncontrollable shivers and recurrent nightmares whenever he tried to sleep. He wrote, "The worst job was to get into our bags. The second, or equally worse, was to lie in them for 6 hours. No one got much sleep at night. Bowers and Cherry Garrard became so exhausted they literally fell asleep while they were pulling their sledges, while they were pulling this. Cherry Garrard's jaws chattered so much that all of his teeth shattered." In his book about the expedition, Cherry Garrard described the Crozier trip as the worst journey in the world. The return trip took 8 days, and the entire journey lasted over 5 weeks. Other members of the expedition gasped when they saw how the Crozier party appeared upon its return, and shuddered when they heard the travelers' tales. Surveying all 3 men, Scott commented, "They looked more weather-worn than anyone I had ever seen. Their faces were scarred and wrinkled, their eyes dull, their hands whitened and creased with constant exposure to damp and cold." Here's a picture of them after they got back getting their first meal. Yet, and this is the point I want to make, after this pure scientific, nothing to do with getting to the pole, pure scientific expedition, these people, 2 months later, 2 of them, it was originally planned to be 3 of them, but Cherry Garrard never recovered from this experience. In his entire life, he never recovered. 2 of them would go with Scott to the pole. So they were already broken and beat somewhat by what they had gone through when they left. Compare that with Amundsen's men, who had spent the winter in their hut. Now, these 2 extreme efforts were only the most dramatic distractions from the expeditions focused on reaching the pole. Whenever in residence at winter quarters, all of the officers and scientists, including Scott, participated in a rigorous regimen of meteorological, magnetic, and oceanographical research with data collected on a daily and sometime hourly basis. Here is Wilson and Bowers doing some of that collecting of meteorological data. The team's marine biologists regularly cut holes in the 8-foot-thick sea ice to dredge for marine specimens throughout the winter. A physicist studied ice and snow crystals. 2 geologists and a glaciologist, here's one of them, stationed at winter quarters, led an extended 6-man journey into the dry valleys, rugged peaks, and enormous glaciers of the Transantarctic Mountains during the expedition's first summer, and then spent the entire winter, rather than helping others prepare to go to the pole, spent the entire winter cataloging their data and doing research at their main base. And then the following summer, when Scott was going south, they went back out in the opposite directions to the Transantarctic Mountains for a second summer of research. Now, further, during the first of these journeys that I just told about, when this group was out during the first summer, they had put stakes over in the mountains across the Farrar Glacier. It's an opposite direction as the pole. They'd gone sort of the other way, and they'd put stakes across the glacier as markers to gauge its movements. Well, the only way you can then see if it moved is to go back the next year and look. Now, as geologists, they were supposed to go to an entirely different area. So the third is, how do we look at if these glaciers moved? Scott decided to go. Just weeks before he was going to head to the pole, Scott takes Bertie Bowers, who we've seen just back from his winter journey with Wilson, a meteorologist, and Edgar Evans, who was going to go with him on the polar trip, on a sledge journey to see if these stakes had moved. Here they are setting out with Scott and Bowers in the front. In his diary, Scott characterized this 2-week trip as a, quote, useful warm-up for the polar journey. But his harshest critic, historian Roland Huntford, later condemned it. He wrote, Scott went 150 miles in a senseless direction. Man-hauling, of course, no dogs, man-hauling. He would have been better to move fresh seal meat along the road to the south. Certainly this trip, done only weeks before they left for the pole, was an ordeal. It included man-hauling a sledge in minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and a forced march of 35 miles in one 24-hour period. Huntford's criticism of it had merit. Yet, and this tells the story of what Scott was all about, 2 days before they leave on this trip, which is only 2 weeks before they're going to the pole. It's in an opposite direction they're going. 2 days before leaving on this trip, Scott writes in his diary, and there he is writing in his diary in the hut, main hut. He wrote, and at this time, all but conceding that Amundsen would beat him to the pole. He knew if Amundsen made it there, if his dogs could get there, that Amundsen, who would travel much faster, would get there first. Scott wrote in his diary, it is really a satisfactory state of affairs all around. If the polar journey comes off, that means I make it to the pole and back. Nothing, not even lost prior to the pole, that is, not even Amundsen getting there first, can prevent my expedition from ranking as the most important one that ever entered a polar region north or south. He thought his would be the greater expedition, even if he didn't win. Science would make it so, and the science must be served, and that includes checking the movement of the glacier. Well, scarcely a month after returning from this trek, and by then 10 days behind Amundsen and leaving, Scott headed south for across the Ross Ice Shelf, up the Beardmore Glacier, that's his route up, and over the polar plateau with teams of men, ponies, tractors, and dogs. Unlike Amundsen, who traveled light and with only those who would go the entire distance, Scott planned to have various supporting teams drop back in stages, and that is the tractors first, and then the ponies, and then the dogs, each of them depoting supplies for the return party. They would fall back until only one party was left to man-haul a single sledge across the 9,000-foot high plateau to the pole. In the end, this group, and here you see a picture of them, well, 4 of them, one has to take the picture, consisted of Scott, Wilson, Bowers, Evans, who just had been on the glacial trip, and British Army Captain Lawrence Titus Oates. So, quickly drawing to a close, since I wanted to talk about the science, and there's not a whole lot of science on this, let me just wrap up by picking up this story as this group approached the pole. Less than 20 miles from the pole, they first sighted debris left by the Norwegian. Up until that time, they didn't know if Amundsen was going to make it. Now they knew he'd made it before them. As Scott wrote, this told the whole story. It is a terrible disappointment, and I am very sorry for my loyal companions. Those companions, however, if you read their diaries, weren't particularly upset. They took comfort in what they did. Bowers wrote, it is sad to have been forestalled by the Norwegians, but I'm glad we've done it by good British man-hauling. For Wilson, the solace came in science. While the Norwegians had won the race, he wrote, we have done what we came for all the same, as our scientific program was made out. Well, the British team found the tent left by the Norwegians, and there the British team around the Norwegians' tent with the Norwegians' flag. They took several rounds of sights to confirm their location and departed the next day. On the return trip, and here they are, their own picture at the pole. They're all in this picture because you can see Bowers is pulling a string to get their picture. But you can see how they look. Look at their faces. Look at what they'd been through compared to the Norwegians who looked fresh at the pole. On the return trip, the surface posed the most relenting problem, with extreme cold producing that sand-like snow that Bowers and Wilson had found during their Crozier journey. It was much the same day after day, if you read the sledgers' diaries, filled with complaints about the snow. All pull, no glide, with the sledge runners sometimes sinking so deep in the granular surface that the crossbars of the sledge literally plowed through the snow. One expects the Antarctic to be cold even in summer, but it had turned colder than normal and, as it became later in the season, much, much colder than Amundsen had ever faced. Hunger stalked the polar party too, even though they traveled on full rations. Near the journey's end, they reached most depots with food to spare, but the prescribed amount for each meal did not supply enough calories for pulling at altitude over poor surfaces at low temperatures. And then the fuel oil began running low due to leakage in the stores left in the depots, which meant cold pemmican rather than warm stew. The unrelented heavy sledding, low temperature, and inadequate diet inevitably weakened everyone. For Evans, the serious troubles began when he gashed his hand on the 31st of December. The wound became infected, and his fingers suffered severe and prolonged frostbite. He lost 3 fingernails. By the time the polar party reached the Beardmore Glacier on the return journey in early February, Wilson noted, and here is my picture of where he's writing. Wilson noted, Evans' fingers discharging pus, nose very bad and looking rotten. By then, Oates' feet had reached a critical stage. Titus's toes are black, Wilson wrote, and his nose and his cheeks are dead yellow. Nevertheless, at this point in their return journey, they took time out for geology as they descended the glacier. Now, let me just capture the picture, because this is our ending picture. That's the Beardmore Glacier. Remember the picture there. There's the Ross Ice Shelf, the barrier down here, which they have to go over a long distance. That's flat, white, featureless. They couldn't do any scientific work there. Then you go up this glacier, or back down it, now they're going. And then at the other end, you get up on the polar plateau, which is 9,000 feet high and solid ice. There's no geology you can do up there. But the one place on their route, and I took this picture from an airplane, as you're going down the glacier or up the glacier, there's this one exposed rock, Mount Buckley, on the side of it. And so on their way, and this is where they took time out for geology on their way back. Now, this is what they saw. That's my picture down. Here's their picture from the glacier going down. That's what they saw. That's their picture of Mount Buckley on the side. Scott wrote, the moraine was obviously so interesting that I decided to camp, to take the team over to the side to camp and to spend a couple days geologizing. We found ourselves under perpendicular cliffs of beacon sandstone, weathering rapidly and carrying variable cold seams. From the last, Wilson, with his sharp eyes, has picked out several plant impressions. He means fossils. Now here is Wilson's picture. This is Wilson's last drawing he ever made. You saw the photograph. Here's he marks where the different rocks are, the different sandstone. You can see it, the glacier, the rocks, and where he took his fossils from. They've gone over here and done this collecting here. From these impressions that he saw, these fossils included some from a distinctive Paleolithic flora called Glossopteris, which geologists on all 3 of the British Antarctic expeditions had been seeking. This flora was known in the fossil record of South America, Africa, and Australia, but biologists were stymied how it got to those desperate places unless it had first evolved in the central Antarctic continent when it was warmer and then moved north as the global climate cooled. By proving that the southern continents were thus once linked at one time historically, linked together, and so these plants could move, finding Glossopteris could help salvage meaning from a failed attempt to reach the pole first. And so they did geology. They collected 35 pounds of rocks and carried them out. This break gave the party its last respite. Evans was the first to go. After floundering down the glacier for a week and falling into several crevasses, he became increasingly disorientated. Wilson thought that Evans had injured his brain in a fall, and by the 16th of February, described him as, quote, sick and giddy and unable to walk even by the sledge on skis. He dropped far behind the others a day later, and when they went back for him, he was on his knees with his gloves off and a wild look in his eyes. By the time they carried him to the tent, he had slipped into a coma and soon died. Leaving the body, they proceeded down the glacier and on to the Ross Ice Shelf. Now, Oates died next. His feet kept getting worse. The cold and the lack of fuel for hot meals contributed to the problem. By the ice shelf's midpoint, he could no longer pull in harness and soon began holding the party back, which irked the soldier in him. On March 11, Scott ordered Wilson to supply everyone with a fatal dose of opium, but Oates struggled on with the others for 5 more days. Scott wrote on the 19th, Oates slept through the night before last, hoping not to wake, but he woke in the morning. It was blowing a blizzard. Oates said, I am just going outside. It may be some time. He went out in the blizzard, and we have not seen him since. It was the act of a gentleman, end quote. March 17, the day Scott wrote this, was Oates's 32nd birthday. The others marched their last on March 19. 2 days earlier, they had left behind everything except the barest essentials, and at Wilson's request, their diaries, field notes, and of course, those 35 pounds of geological specimens. These they carried to the end. Their final camp stood only 11 miles shy of a massive depot stocked with special treats where a relief party had waited to the 10th. Scott's right foot had given out, and their fuel was nearly gone, but they retained some hope of getting through. They knew their approximate location and how far away the depot was. Then a blizzard struck. It lasted at least 8 days, or so Scott's diary states. By then, they had eaten all of their remaining food. Some historians have suggested the blizzard must have ended earlier, but either Wilson and Bowers would not leave Scott or Scott held them back. In any event, they died together, with Wilson and Bowers in an attitude of sleep, and Scott between them, his sleeping bag half open and an arm flung across Wilson. The following spring, a search party found them frozen in that position, along with their notes and, of course, the 35 pounds of geological specimens. Here's a picture of them in the tent when there were still 4 of them on their way back. Lots of us know something about Amundsen and Scott and their expeditions to the South Pole. It's an epic tale that has become part of our common knowledge. As with much of our common knowledge, however, it is somewhat mythologized. From my experience, here's what I have found that most people think. Amundsen and his Norwegian team arrived at the pole first after an amazing dash by dog sled. Scott's group reached it 5 weeks later, exhausted from having man-hauled their sledges much of the way. Scott, for some reason few people fully understand, wanted men to pull and did not want dogs to suffer. Because the 2 teams reached the pole so close together, people naturally view it as a race, some sort of an exotic international Olympiad. Amundsen then rushes back to his base in a stunning exhibition of Scandinavian efficiency. Disappointed in defeat, Scott's men trudged north in worsening weather and waning supplies, succumbing in a snowstorm only miles from their main depot. Over time and countless retellings of the story, Amundsen became a model of modern organization, not necessarily loved, but certainly respected, while Scott seems a heroic but tragic Victorian blunderer, derided by some for his poor planning and choices, but idolized by others for his perseverance in the face of death. Well, the common knowledge is about right on Amundsen, but sorely deficient on Scott. Of the 2 expeditions, Scott was actually the more modern in its conception and a marvel of planning, if not execution. With nearly 40 men wintering in the Antarctic compared to Amundsen's 9, Scott led a complex and multifaceted scientific expedition while Amundsen staked everything on the pole. Further, the common knowledge ignores that Scott's final expedition was the 3rd in a series of 3 British Antarctic expeditions that built directly on a much longer history of Royal Navy voyages of scientific exploration and discovery in the Southern Ocean dating back to the days of James Cook. Initially, a secondary and unspoken ambition of these efforts, being first to the South Pole, gradually became a British obsession. but one only to be achieved in the course of conducting scientific research and detailed mapping. Scott captures this when he writes of his final expedition just before he left. Doubtless there are those who will criticize this provision for scientific research in view of my expedition's public objectives of reaching the South Pole. But I believe that the more intelligent section of the community will heartily approve of the endeavor to achieve the greatest possible scientific harvest which the circumstances permit. The British explorers and their sponsors would never admit to being engaged in a mere dash to the pole. Amundsen had no such inhibitions. He won the race, at least in part, because Scott was handicapped by scientific aims. But in the course of losing that race, researchers on the British expedition helped to open an unknown continent for science. Thank you. Right on time. I'm amazed. Right on time. Any questions? Happy to answer questions. I was told to go for 45 to 50 minutes, which is what it took. Any questions?
All the data that they collected from the South Pole, I know I just read a book about the North Pole explorations, and they used all that data, and they still use it today. Do they still use it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's the baseline. Not necessarily from the pole itself, but all the data collected at Ross Island and the various camps, Cape Adair, certainly that is the baseline for all the scientific research. And it wasn't just meteorological, it was magnetic, it was oceanographic, it was every field that we do science in now, they were doing back then. And it provides the baseline for research. Even the chemical pollutants in the ice, the chemical pollutants in the penguins, they had all that data, and we're using it all to this day. So it is the baseline. We really didn't go back. We kept going to the Arctic because it's just in Canada, It's not very far, and of course Greenland was part of Denmark. What happened is there's this flurry of a dozen expeditions to the South Pole, to the Antarctica. Only Scott made it to the South Pole on a scientific expedition. But there are expeditions from the Germans, the scientific expeditions from the Germans, the Swedes, the Belgian, France, as well as the 3 British, one from Scotland. Those basically started in 1900 and ended with the Great War, with the World War I. And then there's the World War I, and then there's the Depression, and then there's World War II. And so we don't really go back, except for a couple British-American expeditions in the 30s. Nobody goes back until the 50s. And so there's this leap of 40 years gap in the research. But yeah, it's the baseline. And then since the 50s, we've been going back consistently. So absolutely. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned the linking of the southern continent.
Yes.
And plant fossils.
Yes.
Kind of looks like the primary evidence. Is there other evidence that supports that?
Animals as well. I mean, they found some the 3 British expeditions, as well as some of the other expeditions, found a variety of animal freshwater fish. They found a lot of freshwater fish. Of course, now we found dinosaurs. We found a lot of other things, but they didn't know about plate tectonics, though the first inventor of continental drift, which didn't involve plate tectonics, tried to say that Antarctic evidence fit it, and postulated that Antarctica was nestled up there next to Madagascar, which is where we now think it is. But they thought there were land bridges because they didn't know about the continents moved around. But this had been proposed by the distribution of plant fossils that had been discovered in the 1870s in Australia, South America, and Africa. And yet they were very, very similar, and they're like the Glossopteris, but some other plants as well, Paleolithic era. And they couldn't figure out how they could have gotten to all those places. There was no way they could get there unless they had, in the same stage of development, unless they had evolved first in an earlier stage in Antarctica and then moved out as the world got colder. And therefore they moved out of Antarctica. And so from the very first, they had a laundry list of things that the first expedition was supposed to research. I mean, it's a book that's 400-page thick that was assembled by the Royal Society of things you should look for. And there's a whole section on fossils you should look for, and one was this Glossopteris, which they hadn't been able to find. They found others. They found freshwater fish. They found other plant fossils, but they hadn't found the Glossopteris. And actually, this is what Wilson had spotted, the long-sought Glossopteris, and it was in an earlier stage of development than they would later find in Africa, which they had already found in this Africa and India and Australia and South America. And so they thought that it somehow moved across. So that's what they were looking for. So, but it's not just Glossopteris. It's a whole array of fossils, and there's an enormous amount of fossil research done to this day in Antarctica because you find foundational species down there. It's the same way with underwater too, that the water currents go out from Antarctica. There's an undercurrent. So the earlier animals, marine life is also finding it. So that's part of the exciting thing in Antarctic research. It's why so much research is still done there. Any other questions? It's all they predicted, and then they found it. Any other questions? If we tired everyone out? Well, thank you all for coming out here, and I hope you have a wonderful spring. Thank you.